everyone, and welcome to the first conversation of a series based on the book Transforming Language and Literacy Education, New Materialism, Posthumanism, and Onto-ethics, which was published in 2020. My name is Magali Forte, and I have the great pleasure to meet with Dr. Kelleen Toohey today, and with Dr. Saskia Van Viegen. Kelleen and I are located in Vancouver, and Saskia is in Toronto, and we wanted to mention that because we're aware that some of you might be joining us from other places. So we'll start with a land acknowledgement. And we wanted to mention that this land acknowledgement is part of our commitment to supporting linguistic and cultural diversity and working for more socially just educational approaches in our research, our teaching, and our lives as settlers. So I'll do the land acknowledgement for where Kelleen and I are located. We are both affiliated with Simon Fraser University. And at Simon Fraser University, we acknowledge that we live, learn, and teach on the unceded, ancestral, and occupied traditional lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Coquitlam, and Katzie nations of the Coast Salish peoples. And Saskia, I'll let you do yours.
Thank you, Magali. York University is located in Toronto, and we recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tikaranto has been taken care of by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis, and it is now home to many Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and this territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. And just after reading that, I want to share what that means to me too, and how it is a useful reminder to pause and think about how my work is accountable to how it is situated within the structures of settler colonialism in Canada. And I like to support my students in the different courses that I teach at York University to think about how we are all located in that structure of settler colonialism and what that means. So maybe I'd like to just pause now for a moment so we can think about our own land acknowledgements and the ways in which we take them up in our being and working. Thank you.
Thank you, Saskia. So as I said, in June of 2020, this book called Transforming Language and Literacy Education, New Materialism, Posthumanism, and Onto-ethics came out. And while this book was co-edited by Dr. Kelleen Toohey, who's here today, Dr. Susan Smythe, Dr. Diane Borsato, and myself, it would not exist without the precious contributions of several respected scholars, such as Dr. Saskia Van Viegen, who's joining our very first conversation today in this series. Dr. Daniel Heath Justice, who is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and a professor of First Nations and Indigenous Studies and English at UBC, quotes this part of Anishinaabe author Louise Erdrich's beautiful memoir called Books and Islands in Ojibwe Country. So she writes, quote, "Books, why? So I can talk to other humans without having to meet them. Fear of boredom, so that I will never be alone," unquote. And Daniel Heath Justice then adds, quote, "The aloneness of reading isn't loneliness. With books and other stories, whether experienced solitude or lived community, we abide in human presence beyond the flesh and blood of personal experience. When we're in the presence of stories, we're never truly alone." I chose this quote to introduce our conversation with Saskia today for two reasons. The first one is because This quote speaks in an eloquent way about meeting others in our readings. In the pandemic world that we live in, books and written stories have become, if they weren't before already, a powerful way to not feel so alone for many. But technology has also allowed us, when we have access to it, of course, to connect with people face to face, but in a virtual way. And this is the second reason why I chose this quote. Kelleen, Suzanne, Diane, and I decided to start this series of conversations with the wonderful contributors that added their voices and their stories to our book, because we feel that the recorded conversations people will then have access to, such as this one, will be great companions to the chapters that they have written. We hope that you feel that way when you listen to them and engage with them. So thank you, Saskia, for getting us started with this series. I'd like to introduce Kelleen now. So Kelleen Toohey is Professor Emerita in the Faculty of Education at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, BC. And her work in second language education has concerned the teaching of Indigenous languages, heritage languages, and English. She's the author of Learning English at School, Identity, Sociomaterial Relations, and Classroom Practice, which was published in 2018, in which she actually updates her 2000 sociocultural theory-inspired ethnography of children learning English using posthuman and post-structural theory. Kelleen, I'll pass it to you.
Magali. And I'm going to introduce Magali. Magali Forte is a doctoral research assistant in the Faculty of Education at Simon Fraser University, as well as a French immersion teacher in Vancouver. In her research, she adopts a socio-material perspective, putting to work posthumanist, new materialist, and deleuzo-guattarian theories in order to examine identity in a different way in multicultural education settings. Doing so, she acknowledges and continues to learn about the rich Indigenous perspectives that are informing her work. Now I'd like to introduce Saskia. I have this pleasure of introducing my former colleague and much missed colleague, Dr. Saskia Van Viegen. Saskia is an assistant professor in the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Linguistics at York University. Her applied linguistics research concerns bi- and multilingualism in education and focuses specifically on language assessment and language teaching and learning in K-12 and post-secondary educational contexts. She's conducted several empirical projects in collaboration with Ontario and the BC Ministries of Education to lead educator professional learning and build capacity for system-level educational reform, particularly for youth from refugee and immigrant backgrounds. She's co-editor of the book, Plurilingual Pedagogies, Critical and Creative Undertakings for Equitable Language in Education. And she's currently co-editor of the international journal Critical Inquiry and Language Studies. Her research has been published in TESOL Quarterly, the Canadian Journal of Education, the Canadian Modern Language Review, and other places as well. So welcome, Saskia. We're delighted you could be with us today.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I'd like to say
I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, I'd like to say a few words about your chapter.
Sure.
It's called Becoming Posthuman, Bodies, Affect, and Earth in the School Garden. And it tells us about a collaborative inquiry project between yourself, a teacher, and students and their parents from immigrant and refugee backgrounds living in a central Canadian city. It takes us through the inspiring story of the creation of a school garden by the community. Saskia actually explains that she's revisiting this story, which was initially constructed and viewed through a sociocultural perspective. This time, Saskia chose to go beyond language, to use her words, and to adopt a new materialist perspective. One of the things we are going to ask all of our contributors is, how did you first get interested in posthumanism, new materialism, or deleuzo-guattarian?
Thank you, Kelly. This is a great question, and it took me back to thinking about when did this happen? And also, your question inspired me or makes me think now about another piece I want to talk about, which is starting in the middle of things versus beginnings and endings, which we sometimes impose. And I think that's part of this conversation. During my doctoral work at the University of Toronto, OISE, one of my committee members, Dr. Stephanie Springgay, is a wonderful writer in the area of new materialities and affect theory, and we had many conversations to engage with not only the data that the project was producing, or generating, but those conversations turned into conversations about the generation of something called data and what that means. And this brings me to something that's not in my chapter. This is a personal story. As part of my work once on Stephanie Springgay's research team, we gathered sensory data from a mushroom foraging activity in New York City. And when I was invited to be part of this research creation event and documentation, it was very interesting because it was documenting the work of an artist, but also experiencing the moment and performance art. And in documenting this Mushroom Foray, it was called, and the name of the artist is just slipping my mind at this moment. I'd like to acknowledge it, and maybe we can add that to this video later, a link to the work. In conceptualizing this performance art, as I came to learn in the project, there was no real documentation of the art. There was no video to watch after. It was not being recorded. You either had to be there or that's it, the performance was over. And that was a new way of thinking for me, because conventionally I would have thought, oh, of course we have, if we're here to document this artistic performance, then we should be recording it, right? But Dr. Springgay told me, no, we're not recording this. We're just being here and participating and experiencing the feeling, the affect of being here with the others. And the performance involved walking through the streets of New York City and Chinatown in particular, looking for exotic mushrooms with the New York Mycological Society. And so it was intervening in this activity to raise questions a little bit about what do we frame as exotic or not in particular spaces, and according to which cultural practices and ontologies. So this raised for me a new way of thinking about something called data and documentation, and troubled some categories and understandings that I thought I knew about empirical work, about research methods, about where research starts and ends. And that's one thing that Stephanie also talked about, was about beginning in the middle of something. Because when we start with a particular research method, an interview, or a participant observation, and we write in our documentation of that data gathering that it began at this time and it ended at this time, but that's an imposed timeline, perhaps. So yeah, so that was that changed my thinking.
Great.
And in
Thank
fact, one of the mushrooms that we gathered was this candy cap mushroom that was identified based on its scent, and it smells like maple.
you.
And
Wow.
that smell will stay with me for a long time. And I kept a piece of this mushroom in a bag, and I had it in my desk for some time. It was I think it was a dried mushroom. I had it in my desk for some time, but every time I would open up that drawer, the scent would come out.
Mm.
And I think that resonates. So maybe my turn to this way of thinking was like the scent of that mushroom in the drawer, that it just didn't, it permeated, and when you opened it, and you
Great.
can't forget it. Yeah.
I like
Thanks.
that. Yeah, thank you. I like that, and I like how you talked about it really sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that what you're saying is that there's value in considering the research inquiries that we do, the research projects that we do, as lived experiences, as lived timelines, rather than those imposed timelines that you were mentioning. And Kelleen and I were reflecting, actually preparing for this interview, and the way that you articulate affect throughout the theoretical kind of parts of your chapter, and the almost aesthetic quality that it has. You quote Grosch, I think, in the chapter, and you say that you want to focus on with her on what affects do. And so it's different than the beautiful story that you just shared with us, because as you said, that particular experience wasn't recorded, and here you wrote about the school garden, but maybe I don't know if you want to say a few words about this idea that there's value in focusing on what affects do in our research projects in relation with the school garden project.
Sure. Well, I really appreciate thinking about affect not just as emotion, and which is, maybe some would say a sociocultural labeling of a particular affect. And so, of course, this labeling is important to us because it might be how we language our feelings, how we language our affects. But indeed, affect is a sensation, and it's neither, the way I understand it, it doesn't have to be positive or negative. It is just something that arises in response to something else in our perception and in our setting, wherever we are, in our entanglements, and the between human to human, or human to object, human to land. I think in the chapter, and like you just mentioned about Gross's work about experiencing art, that it arises an emotion, an affect within us. And it's that sensation that I'm interested in, because I think those are the moments where something different might be possible. And I can link this up to teacher education, because this is something I've been talking about with my dear friend Sunny Lau from Bishop's University. Having had the privilege to work in teacher education or TESOL training for many years now, and learn from educators, both experienced educators and educators who are new to the field, novice educators, so-called novice educators. I'm realizing that when I want to teach about teaching, I don't like to talk about particular strategies, instructional strategies, and resources and materials that we can rely upon in our classes. And even for myself in planning a syllabus, of course, resources and readings are important. But I think what I've learned is I can give students and teacher candidates readings about how to recognize students' rich cultural and linguistic backgrounds, the knowledge traditions of their communities, and so on. We can read about it, and I can say in your class, make sure you make space for students' funds of knowledge, which Kelleen has written about. I love that article back from 2010, I think, with Marshall. It's a Marshall.
Beth Marshall, yeah.
Beth, thank you. You know, we can tell teachers to do that, but if they don't, what I've realized is what is more helpful to me in my classroom is when I can help them feel that that is important.
Yeah.
Once they feel that, they will never teach any other way, I think. So I like to design my course assignments as inquiries where educators do something, learn about something, usually starting with their self, to have an affective experience reflecting upon their own experience. And so when I'm trying to teach, for example, about multilingualism, translanguaging practice, plurilingualism, social justice, I first like to have students, for example, draw a language portrait about themselves and write their own language learning history. And then we engage with that critically so that they have an affective experience, remembering critical moments in their own language learning history. And then by talking about those critical affective moments, these moments we don't forget, that stick. And I think I read in a chapter about Ahmed's notion of sticky affects being sticky.
Yeah.
When we can use those as the resources in the classroom, those are so much more powerful. And that's how I like to teach now, is I like to create activities that generate an affective experience, because then change is possible. So maybe that's what affects do in my practice. And of course, we can extrapolate that to life in general. And I always, when I'm explaining this to my students, I always use one fun example. I say, you know, what were you wearing a month ago today? Or where were you sitting at 4 o'clock a month ago today? And nobody can remember. But if I say, where were you when you had your first kiss? Or, you know, then they can remember the setting. They remember everything about that moment. And obviously that's something that sticks. So I like to create these kinds of sticky moments.
Sticky moments, I like that.
In one point in your chapter, Saskia, you talk about the procedures that you used for gathering data in the classroom, and that they became inadequate to you. I just wondered if you'd like to say a little bit more about that. What did you do differently this time?
Sure. And you know what, it was recently the 2021 AAAL conference, and I was watching a talk by some colleagues, and I heard Claire Crampsh ask the question. She was a discussant on a panel, and she asked the question, what credence should we give to data on the discursive evidence from users? And it was raised in the context of talking about digital literacies and algorithms and the ways in which digital social media and cell phones, et cetera, are mediating our experience, machine technology, and so on. How sometimes our discourses and even some of our practices are so influenced by these neoliberal tools, these commercialized tools, these tools that are used for surveillance, for militarization, for monitoring, and subversive forms of data collection, for example, that they have become part of our discourses. They've become part of what we say, our rhetoric. And so when just relying upon what people are saying, maybe it's not enough sometimes. Maybe we can raise some questions about what the discourses that we are using comprise, and what are they influenced by. And so going back to the chapter, it was a very powerful engagement with this class, and these children who were ranging in age from 8 to 10 years old, and they had a lot that they thought about, that they knew, and to just sit and ask them in an interview, okay, well, tell me a little bit about your background, or you're new to Canada, tell me a little bit about your experience so far in your new school and in your new community, and what is different than, or what was it like in your old school, in your last school or community? How's your family doing in these processes, etc. When you ask children these questions, you don't get rich responses, because then this interview structure it's really impoverished, because they don't know me, they don't trust me. Why should they talk to me about their personal ideas and ways of thinking? And at the same time, developmentally, they might still be making sense of their own experience. And, why should I have the privilege of a researcher to just walk into their space and begin to gather data for my dissertation project based on their lived experiences? Even if their parents have given consent, would they still want that 20 years from now, or when they can give consent? So it's so complicated, and maybe it wasn't very productive. But what was more useful in the context of that project and to learn from the students was to be with them. This being with was a generative way to understand their experience and gather so-called data about their lives. And through their storytelling, through their schoolwork, through building a garden together, I came to know them. I came to know their families, their parents, some of their parents, their teachers. That was far more effective. And if I had designed the study, again, this was for my doctoral research so a long time ago, if I had designed the study just based on these traditional methods of extraction, I don't know I don't know if the work would have been as rich. I don't know if it would have been as transformative as it was for me. I can say that it was transformative for me. I don't want to make, and I think you write in the introduction to the book about overclaiming what we might know about language and literacy through our data collection methods. So I don't want to claim that it was transformative for anybody else, but I can say that it was transformative for me, this act of being there. And I think it was generative in the sense that we learned things about the students' language and literacy practices, about what they needed from school, what they needed from their teachers. And that was, I'm really glad we shifted in that way.
Thanks.
As you were talking about that, Saskia, I was reminded of the words of Maori scholar Linda Tuhiwai Smith, who wrote that the word research is probably one of the dirtiest words in the Indigenous world's vocabulary, and that for her and for many Indigenous scholars and Indigenous people, it just like, and I'm quoting her again, it stirs up silence, it conjures up bad memories because of this kind of like tendency that a lot of the Western conventional traditional research has done in terms of extracting, like you were saying, extracting knowledge and claiming ownership of ways of knowing, of things that Indigenous peoples were doing or saying or sharing. And I just love how, in a way, posthumanist and new materialist theories and deleuzo-guattarian theory allows us to kind of focus on more relational ways of doing research, and I'm always trying in my work to acknowledge how much in that sense they're indebted to Indigenous perspectives that have put that forward for a very long time, relationality being really like at the core of Indigenous people's ways of seeing the world, of being in the world. And I think that you did a beautiful work of portraying a story, a relational story like that in your chapter, and that's one of my favorite parts. And I thought that there's a quote that you share towards the end of your chapter. I love that you have these little quotes from the participants, from the children. Yeah. Yes, they're beautiful. Yeah. And this one is from Somaya, and I thought it was so powerful, and I'll read it out loud. She said, and you wrote, "I always used to think that it's hopeless because I'm just a child. And whenever somebody, a child, has an idea, adults don't really listen to it. They just ignore that person, that child, and that child can really help make a difference. So I thought to myself, I'm going to stand up for myself and make a difference." And so Kelleen and I were reflecting on the fact that one of the threads that you trace throughout your chapter is the idea that our normative, conventional, pedagogical, and research approaches in language and literacy education need to be unsettled because they're built and function on a deficit view of children's competencies, and especially, you know, in the case of immigrant children here, refugee children whose English might be considered as lacking, and that's just harmful. So you offer this idea that you spoke about a little bit in your previous answer of letting go of language and social interaction as the primary tools for observing, for documenting, and for generating understanding. And this might help us in this endeavor to not see children primarily as deficient. And so you further state in the chapter that you turn to the notions of posthuman subjectivity and becoming, and I'm quoting your words, in an effort to think beyond language in our language teaching and research. So I'm just wondering if you want to speak a little bit about that, and especially in researching with children, this importance of this kind of like relational sense and how that might help us get beyond those deficit views of children in language and literacy education.
Absolutely. It's a very important question. And I'm also really influenced by Eve Tuck's work. She's an Indigenous scholar at the University of Toronto now at OISE, and she wrote a fabulous letter published in the Harvard Ed Review some time ago calling for an end to damage-centered research. And that was really powerful to me to read and understand, because she calls attention to what is our starting point for what we are, right, for the story that we're trying to tell, and how are we acknowledging that we might be complicit in reproducing damage-centered narratives through our research, and how can we be mindful of challenging that, of countering that, and and suggesting some other potentialities for doing research that is not beginning with the idea that something is wrong. And unfortunately, in the province of Ontario, where I work, the term English language learner is part of our curriculum policy. And this is a label that categorizes and names students by who they are not, or what they do not have. It's a real deficit orientation to start with, and this is in our schools and in our schooling. And so how can we engage in, for example, what Patty Lather calls, and I think I referenced this in the chapter, a doubled reading that is both critique and complicity. How are we complicit with these understandings and these categorizations, and what might we do to undo them? And I do think this is tied up with ontology and epistemology. These aren't just, of course, it's social justice focused, but is it possible to do social justice work if we don't also reflect on our ontologies and epistemologies and the ways in which we think about what counts as knowledge, or how we might come to understand a phenomena is complicit with these damage-centered approaches to understanding people and communities and land even.
Saskia, I was wondering about your current work. Are you using materialism or relational ontologies in your current work, and how, if you could say a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. In fact, my current work, which is just one major project, which is just coming to a conclusion, is a bit of an extension of this work from my doctoral studies. In this project, I'm part of a team of researchers across Canada, led by Maureen Kendrick at the University of British Columbia, examining language and literacy practices with youth who have been displaced or have experienced forced migration before coming to Canada, who are labeled as refugees or who may have refugee status when they arrive. So in that work, so many of the lessons from this current project, from my dissertation project, carry over into this current project, because there are some similarities in students' experiences broadly, and in how they are experiencing school now, and what is coming up in terms of their experiences, not necessarily always talking about how they are languaging in their classroom, or talking about literacy, so to speak. There's so much more that is going on. And again, in terms of the way in which we endeavor to gather data in this project, we're very much participant observers in the classroom. So being there in the classroom and co-teaching or co-planning with teachers, working with students one-on-one, supporting them, and responding openly to the directions that we moved in that project. So like this particular project, we started looking at language and literacy, but we ended up making a garden together. Right. This project similarly is inviting of the potentials and the different directions that we are going in.
And I love that because you just said that the fact that it started with a certain view of language and literacy, the project that you document in your chapter, and that it became about a school garden. I love how at the same time it broadens what we think literacy and language education is. Kelleen and I were wondering about if you wanted to speak a little bit about the relationship that you developed with the teacher and with the children, since you've been talking.
Actually, I just wanted to ask.
Oh, sorry.
Saskia about that.
Great.
Just, how did you negotiate that relationship? What did you do and what did he do, and so on?
I think this even connects to the last question too, because what it emphasizes for me is that the research was grounded in everyday practice, and to see what filters into these everyday practices and these everyday experiences of teachers. So I was just wanting to add to the last thing that we talked about, that by being grounded in these everyday experiences, that's where there becomes more space to see how things like discrimination and inequity and difference intersect in the classroom. And so in terms of what that means for creating a space for research in the classroom, it was very much important to establish trust and a kind of mutual engagement in the work. And I'm thinking about that not just in relation to that project, but also the current project now too. That when, as a university-based researcher, we are asking to go into a teacher's classroom, that is a big responsibility on behalf of the researcher. And it is a big risk that the teacher is taking and opening themselves to have somebody there day after day, or to have someone present. And again, if we're thinking about entanglements in the classroom, bringing a new person into the classroom changes the entanglements. It changes that network and the relations among everybody there. So there's no way to be objective, I think, in that sense, or to be separate. You're there, you're part of it, you're entangled in it. And so when we ask for consent to enter into that space, that's a big piece. And it's a really important piece to establish, not just once, but I think in an ongoing way for every different activity that is happening, because new things are going to come up. If you are really grounded in everyday practice, you have to be open to going to where the classroom is at a particular time, or going with a particular conversation, or and I'm also really mindful of that, because right now, during the COVID-19 pandemic and the ways that schools are being held, remote schooling is taking place remotely and classes are held online. It even underscores further the intrusion of an additional person to that space. And what does it mean to record something, and with video recording or with audio recording. And so talking about that transparently at every stage was really important. And so we had those conversations. And what it means for me today is things like, with this pandemic happening and the teachers that I'm working with, it means frequently checking in with them and saying, is this a good week? And is there something I can do to be of service? What feels comfortable for you in terms of wanting me to be there or not? And how can I respect what else is going on and step back? So for example, in that other project, we're not in the classroom anymore. We've made that decision to support the teachers by having periodic meetings with them to reflect and to debrief and talk about things, help them make sense of their experiences, but not showing up in this time. It's not the right time for that particular work. For that project, for the garden project, it also meant when I showed up with the teacher and he said, okay, yes, you're welcome to come, please join my classroom. Let's engage in these interesting activities that you're suggesting, like making some films together, making some digital stories together. Sure, I'm excited about that. And I said, okay, I'm here as a participant and I'm going to be guided by what's going on in the classroom. It meant things like I didn't write the interview protocol for the students. The students wrote their own interview questions and interviewed one another. That was what that meant. Me letting go of some of these conventional ways of doing things. And then it also meant, and this is how the garden came about, when he said, well, you know, these are really interesting things and we're very interested in making a film, but what are we going to make that film about? And I said, well, what are you interested to do? And I was thinking it would be something relating to literacy. And he said, well, I'm very interested in eco-justice and the environment and land-based pedagogies, and I'd like to make a garden.
Beautiful.
And also that was inspired by the students' comments too, because, and I think I talk about this in the chapter where we were learning how much experience their families had in farming and agricultural practice in their home communities. And so we wanted to create, or he wanted to create this opportunity for families to do that at the school. And so that was also what this was about in that relationship. Me to be really reciprocal, to say, all right, I'll go there with you. Let's do this together. And it was wonderful. And had I thought that I could have planned it all in advance, I think it would have been a much more impoverished study. I don't think it would have been as rich if I had been structured and followed a set path. And fortunately, the university was open to that kind of participatory research. There was a space for that. And I know that these days ethics review boards are getting more and more strict about what we write in consent forms. That every research activity needs to be determined in advance. So it's a balance.
That kind of responsiveness is becoming more and more difficult.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's too bad. I'm reminded as you're articulating your research, your relational research posture of Awad Ibrahim's words. I think it's an article from 2014 that he wrote that's called "Research as an Act of Love: Ethics, Emigres, and the Praxis of Becoming Human." And he also mobilizes theories of the posthuman in his more recent work. But I like that. I like really considering research as an act of love, as a reciprocal kind of endeavor that's not happening in a vacuum, but that has real life consequences, and that we can kind of consider when our institutions allow it within these limitations as a becoming, as something that's ever changing.
Yes, and as an applied researcher, I take that very seriously, that applied notion of the work. So that's part of the commitment, is that this is to well, to borrow the words of the student in the chapter, this is to make a difference.
Yes.
to be with someone while they're making a difference, or I wouldn't want to just be removed and university based and not in classrooms. It matters to me to be in classrooms, and it's hard. There's a lot to navigate, and again, especially today, and working with youth at the secondary level, for example, I'm reminded of that all the time. Their experiences are changing so fast.
Yes.
And are very different from what I'll just say from what I think I know. So really showing up and being there and being with them is, for me, the best way to learn about the concepts and the ideas that I'm interested in doing inquiry around. And I like that word inquiry too, almost more than research, because we can all engage in this kind of inquiry. We can all engage in research too, but I guess for me right now, that word and thinking about inquiry and thinking about raising questions is a lot more important than finding answers.
Thank you.
Magali, I have the sense that
we've
talked for an hour.
Yeah.
That maybe
I think we can, those were beautiful words to end on. I agree. Yes.
But Saskia, do you have questions of us?
Oh, this is what a rich and wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed your questions, and I guess sure, I do have a question. I'm wondering back to you, what difference has this book made for you and your thinking? Because obviously bringing together the perspectives of writers and researchers from different locations and different projects, as editors, you get to step back and think about some of these contributions. What have you gained?
Do you want to go first, Magali?
Sure. As an emerging scholar, it's been a very rich source of learning for me on so many levels, but talking about the theoretical kind of the theoretical ground that it's given me. I was already interested in posthumanism and new materialism before kindly being offered to join the wonderful team of co-editors that Kelleen, Suzanne, and Diane had formed prior to me joining them. But it just really gave me the time and the space to think with a wealth of different concepts, because the contributors just like have different orientations to which concepts they wanted to use with their research projects, and then seeing how they were all applying them to their inquiries, to their ways of thinking, and working at deconstructing the way that we conventionally do research, and the way that like you talked a little bit about this during the interview, Saskia, but the things that we take for granted in research, whether it has to do with gathering data, with generating knowledge, it's really helped me gain an insight into valuable examples of how it's possible to do inquiries that are really in the moment, that are anchored in the worlds in which we develop our inquiries and we live with them. The relational piece is really important in a lot of the chapters, and it's really helped me to take a different look at the research project that I'm involved with in my own doctoral journey. So I'm very, very grateful for the support that I got from it, the validation that I got from it, and yeah, again, the very special safe space that allowed me to think deeper about my own project.
And we should say that Magali made such a difference to our
Oh, you're
research
kind.
team too, because
Thank you.
she's the most incredible reader. She has an eagle eye, and she suggested so many other things that we could look at and learn from. And it was just a complete, well, we all said it couldn't have happened in the way that it did without you. So thank you very much for that.
Thanks for saying that, Kelleen.
For me, I mean, I've been playing with these ideas for a couple of years now, and it wasn't so much in the initial getting of the papers and editing them and so on that I felt that it was really generative. But when it was finished, I read the whole book again, and I was just blown away by how my feelings of, these people have taken a bunch of concepts that are complicated and unfamiliar and put them to work in real situations.
Mhm.
And I really liked the book when it was done. I thought it was that every one of the chapters gave a unique and important contribution to our understanding of how this, it's difficult. It's admittedly difficult to understand how to put this to work. And I had a better idea of that after having read it.
Mm-hmm. Me too. Writing for this book as well. That was very facilitative in that way.
Yeah.
No, it was great. I really enjoyed it. Thanks.
It was
wonderful.
It was
Me
really,
too.
really
Me too.
nice.
So nice
Thanks
to see you
again.
both.
Yeah,
and to
lovely
dive
to
back
see your
into
face.